Jackie. The night after Super Tuesday, and there are a lot of questions about where the Republican candidates stand on delegates. The AP and Fox News have their numbers. But what are those numbers based upon, and how accurate are they? Well, Ben has a reality check.
Well, let's start by pointing out that winning states is really not the contest here. Winning delegates is. Last night, during their Super Tuesday election coverage, a number of news outlets have started reporting delegate numbers. Now, remember, the number all candidates are trying to get to is 1,144 delegates to secure the Republican nomination for president. According to, for instance, let's say Election 2012 GOP delegate tracker, it's the Wall Street Journal site, Mitt Romney has a sizable lead with 415 delegates. Santorum is second with 176 delegates. Newt Gingrich is third with 105 delegates. And Ron Paul is a distant fourth with 47 delegates. So where do those numbers actually come from? Well, about half of them are guesses. Let me try to explain where these numbers come from. So far, there have been 20 statewide contests, either primaries or caucuses. In some states, the process is a binding vote, meaning the delegates are automatically assigned to a candidate if that candidate wins a state outright, and if they win in that state's congressional districts. But in other states, these contests are non-binding, meaning the selection of delegates really has nothing to do with who wins the vote. I'll show you what I mean in a minute. But first, let's talk about what we do know. Some states like Florida, they make it really easy. This year, Florida has 50 delegates. They are bound delegates, which means it's a truly winner-take-all. Mitt Romney won Florida. So when those 50 delegates go to the convention in Tampa, they must, on the first round of voting, vote for Romney. Here's how the numbers break down. Romney won 7 in New Hampshire, 50 in Florida, 38 in Massachusetts, just to name a few, and at least 13 in Ohio. From the numbers we know, Romney has at least 244 delegates. Clearly, he has the most of these winner-take-all states. The other candidates look like this. Newt Gingrich had a big win in South Carolina for 23 delegates. Also, his win in Georgia last night gives him 23 more delegates, though he'll likely pick up even more as the congressional districts are counted. Gingrich also got 6 in Nevada as well. He sits at 52 delegates. Santorum, well, he won 3 in Nevada, 14 in Michigan, and because he did not qualify for delegates in all the congressional districts in Ohio, it's really unclear how many he actually picked up last night. So we do know that Santorum has at least 17 delegates. But he also won Oklahoma and Tennessee last night. Those are proportional states with 95 delegates between them to be split up. And then there's Ron Paul, who hasn't won a single contest. Nevertheless, he's been picking up delegates. He grabbed 3 in New Hampshire, 5 in Nevada, 3 in Virginia. That totals 11 delegates. He also finished second in North Dakota and Washington and Vermont, which are all proportional states, meaning he'll pick up additional bound delegates there as well. Now that was the easy part. So here's where all the conjecture comes in. Of the 20 contests thus far, 7 of them are non-binding straw polls. That essentially means that it doesn't matter who wins the caucus vote, because the delegates are allowed to vote for any candidate they choose. That means there are 28 from Iowa, 36 from Colorado, 40 from Minnesota, 24 from Maine, 29 from Wyoming, and 40 from Washington. That comes to 197 unbound delegates. Those delegates, again, can vote for any candidate they choose. So the real question becomes, who are those delegates going to vote for? Well, no one really knows. But the 2 campaigns with the most organization are the Romney campaign and the Paul campaign. In fact, you've probably heard people asking why Ron Paul was still in the race, having not won a single contest. There are reports from all of these unbound states that his supporters are the ones snatching up the majority of those 197 delegate spots. So here's what you need to know. Santorum says he's not out. Gingrich says he isn't going anywhere. And Paul says that he's winning. That's because there is a lot of race left. About 34 more contests still to be held, including contests in Puerto Rico and Guam. So how far will this go? Well, who knows? But the last time a Republican candidate didn't make it to the convention, already locking up the needed delegates, it was 1976, when then-Governor Ronald Reagan nearly pulled a coup and took the nomination away from Gerald Ford. And he nearly did it by picking up all of those unbound delegates. And that is Reality Check.
Steve, it is March Madness of a different kind. Reality Check has been telling you for months that the real race for the Republican primary isn't happening in the state-to-state contest. The real contest is who wins the delegates. We can now confirm there are some cases where some candidate supporters are attempting to change the rules of the caucuses in order to manipulate the delegate process. Ben has the reality check you won't see anywhere else.
Well, we have been closely watching the delegate process while most of the media is simply ignoring it. And yet the selection of delegates, I've told you this, not who wins the beauty contest from state to state, that will determine the Republican candidate for president. Tonight we're going to show you what went down in one precinct in Missouri on Saturday. This is the St. Charles, Missouri caucus. This is where voters come to become delegates and then move on to the congressional district conventions and the state GOP convention. From there, delegates are voted on, again to advance to the Republican National Convention in Tampa, where they will vote for the Republican nominee for president. Missouri will have 52 delegates at the Republican National Convention. Well, around 1,000 people showed up on Saturday in St. Charles to caucus. Now, the first problem started when a rule was made that no one would be allowed to record what took place. The problem with that rule, these meetings are to be conducted under Robert's Rules of Order, and yet no rules committee was ever formed. Even so, police were called in. Take a look. So no videos allowed, but with cell phones in hand, a lot of audio was recorded. Eugene Dokes from the Missouri GOP is speaking in this audio we're going to share with you. He was the temporary chairman whose job it is to carry out the nomination and the approval of an official caucus chairman.
I hereby appoint Andy Haney the chairman, Cheryl Bates, Jeff Pelletier, Chrissy Swann.
So just to make clear what just happened there, Eugene Dokes, instead of accepting nominations from the floor for a caucus chair, as the rules state, instead he appoints a chairman of his choosing. And the crowd, well, they don't like it at all. The place goes nuts. Dokes then decides that he's going to adjourn the meeting. The problem there? Under the Missouri GOP Chairman's Guide, the chairman cannot adjourn the meeting without 2/3 support of the assembly. Also, according to the rules, the delegate selection caucus must take place at the same location where it was advertised in writing 15 days prior. That location was the high school.
Are we going to let the St. Charles County Central Committee railroad all of us? No! Nope. Then let's stand our ground and have a caucus right here.
And that's what they did. Brent Stafford, along with one of the top parliamentarians in the state of Missouri, they decided to reconvene the caucus right there in the parking lot.
We have to have a roster. We have to turn in a roster. Okay? So right now, we have to be quick about it. And when you need to, if you got a piece of paper or percolate it, you got to get everybody's name. Give it to me. Also, you should have a number on your bracelet. Write it next to your name. Okay. Name, address, and your bracelet number. Do we email it? You understand? Yes. Don't get us done before the SWAT team comes.
Before the SWAT team comes, he said, and police did come. Within minutes, Brent Stafford was arrested. I talked with Brent via Skype about his arrest.
They took me away from the crowd and handcuffed me and started walking me towards their police cars and their paddy wagon. Request for answers of if am I being arrested or detained, and what am I being charged with. We're met with answers, but we'll tell you later.
In the end, the cops charged Stafford with trespassing. Now, here's the deal. St. Charles police had no business arresting Stafford. Not only was the crowd not out of control, as you saw plainly in that video, and they were convening at the high school, the proper location for the caucus, but they were actually acting in exact accordance with the rules stated in the Missouri GOP Chairman's Guide, which states on page 33, section 5.7.7. The title of the section, Chairman Walks Out, and it reads, should the chairman walk out or otherwise vacate his duties with no intention of returning, declaring the meeting adjourned without the support of the assembly and leaving the premises, which is what happened, the body should proceed with declaring the chair vacant. And the rules go on to say a new chair shall be appointed by the remaining members of the caucus, and they continue the caucus process right then. That's what happened.
Today on Talk Radio, on a show called Allman in the Morning, Eugene Dokes admitted that he and members of the State Central Committee, they were trying to control the outcome of the delegate selection.
What we were hoping to do, I think, was not have a full takeover of one particular group where they might only be represented by 1% of the county, but yet they would get all of the delegates. They didn't think that was fair for St. Charles County.
So here's what you need to know. The bottom line here, that is not the job of party leaders. The point of a caucus is you show up and you make your voice heard, and your voice counts. But for too long, party leaders have decided they know better, and they need to and have to control the outcome. This year, Republicans are not falling in line, and that is Reality Check.
Well, the fight for delegates in the Republican race just keeps getting uglier with each state we look into. We told you last night about members of the Missouri GOP admitting to attempting to shape the outcome of delegates at the state caucus on Saturday. And tonight, new video out of the state of Georgia this time where the same thing has happened. Ben has the Reality Check.
I've told you that this is the real March Madness. In January, February, and early March, saw a lot of straw poll contests in the Republican race. But it is in the months of March and April when those states hold the contests that really matter, the delegate selection caucuses. And thanks to cell phone video, we're getting a whole new look at how dirty these contests can be. Take a look. This is video from the Athens, Clark County, Georgia GOP Delegate Selection Caucus. As I've told you, these caucus meetings should be pretty relaxed because a very clear process of rules is supposed to be followed. Robert's Rules of Order. Now, the video I'm about to show you, it takes place as a member of the nominating committee is reading off a list of names for nomination as delegates. Once the list is read, members of the caucus are supposed to vote on whether they want to accept that slate of delegates or not accept it. They can also make motions from the floor regarding the list. So here's what happens.
We will have the reading from the nominations committee.
Marvin Brown and James Garland.
I move the slate be accepted.
Second.
So just to keep things clear, the list of nominations is read, and then the chairman gets a motion to accept, that's correct. Then a second from the floor, that's also correct. He then calls for those in favor to say aye, those against no, all of the correct procedures. But now, here's where we get off the rails. So why are they yelling division? Now, if you're rusty on your Robert's Rules of Order, let me explain. A division is to call for a vote, or more specifically, to call for a division of the assembly. The purpose for calling for the division of the assembly is to secure an accurate count of the vote, especially when the vote has been taken by voice, as was the case here. It provides for a standing vote. A division does not need a motion. You see, anyone can call for it from the floor. It can be demanded even after a motion carries. You see, this allows absolute clarity about how many are voting yay, they all stand and are counted, and then how many members are voting against, they all stand and are counted. Pretty simple stuff here. So back to the video. What does the chairman, who under the rules has no authority to deny that count, have to say?
I call to question the chair. An appeal from the decision of the chair.
Second. This is to discuss the convention's now closed. Division. I'm sorry.
Can you count the ayes? Violating state party rules.
The list is present at this time.
And you are jeopardizing all of the delegates from this precinct.
If you have any questions, feel free to discuss this with the Georgia GOP Secretary, John Padgett. Thank you all for coming, and we'll be in touch.
And there you have it. As the call for division is made over and over and over again, instead of carrying out a simple head count of people in the room, which would have taken all of 30 seconds, the chair simply says, "I'm sorry, we're done." I talked with Frankie Brown, who was at that meeting. She says the majority of people in the room were against that slate of delegates, and because the meeting was improperly conducted and adjourned, those who were calling for division, well, they have now created their own slate of delegates, which they have sent to the state party.
Reconvened the next day, and we followed every single rule to the letter, and we submitted our legal slate of delegates to the Georgia State GOP. So now what they have from Athens, Clark County is an illegal slate of delegates from their friends who run the GOP here in Athens. And then they have a legally voted on slate of delegates from us.
So here's what you need to know. Those voters in Athens and Clark County, they are now looking for a lawyer, and they're willing to sue, they say, to require that their vote is not stolen. Athens and Clark County, though, isn't alone. Also in Fulton County, Georgia, and in Carroll County, Georgia, same issues took place. And the response by the GOP leadership in these districts, it's essentially the same thing. They're trying to make sure, they say, that these caucuses aren't taken over and that delegates are selected fairly. But where they're off base, the only fair process is one where the caucus goer who takes the time to become engaged in the process, who's willing to show up, and who votes according to the rules is heard. And that is Reality Check.
Well, in the last few weeks, Reality Check has been telling you about the dirty tricks being used in the race for the Republican nomination, specifically the contests to get delegates for each of the 4 remaining candidates. Tonight, how political operatives in Washington state are trying to game the system. Ben has the Reality Check you won't see anywhere else.
Well, I've already shown you video out of Missouri where GOP officials attempted to railroad the selection of delegates at the St. Charles caucus. And I also showed you video out of Athens, Clark County, Georgia, where state officials steamrolled over caucus goers by forcing an unapproved slate of delegates down their throats. Well, now comes video out of Washington state where local activists attempted to game the system by creating what they called a unity slate. Here's some of that video.
You are about to elect delegates to the state convention.
Right.
And who that is depends on your votes. Now, most districts don't have a majority for any of one of the 3 major candidates for president. None of them have majorities. So we looked at that and we said, why don't we create one group of people that represents all 3 campaigns, representatives from every 3 campaigns, and we'll put them on a list and we'll ask all 3 campaigns' delegates, you, to vote for them.
So let me catch you up on what's going on here. This is at the Pierce County 2nd District Delegate Caucus. The man in the video is Alex Hayes. He's the executive director of Mainstream Republicans of Washington. It's not the same as the official Washington State Republican Party. Let's be clear about that. Hayes is trying to convince caucus goers to vote for a unity slate. He says he wants delegates who are Romney, Gingrich, and Santorum supporters to form a coalition in order to block the delegates of Ron Paul. Listen.
We didn't do this until we saw 3 legislative districts get taken over in King County by the Ron Paul folks, and we saw how they were willing to behave. So at that moment, we decided we had to be a bit more careful, and this represents that commitment of being more careful.
Now, to be clear, taken over by the Ron Paul folks? In King County, Paul supporters have shown up in large numbers, and they are winning through the process the delegate slots. Hayes, who says he is presenting this unity slate on behalf of the Romney campaign, says that he must do so because of the savagery of Paul supporters.
Most years, we're not forced to do this. But this year, we have been forced to do this because of the savagery of the opposition we're facing. And so that's a pretty strong phrase. But if you had seen what it is like when they prevail and they take control, it is very bad.
Andy Jacobson, who was at that Pierce County precinct meeting, says most people were confused about that unity slate.
As they're starting the meeting, they're passing out this unity slate. So, and you know, it was the weirdest thing because it looked like it was coming from the people who were actually leading the meeting. In my case, that was not the case, as I understand it, in other districts. But in the 28th, it was pretty apparent that it was coming from the leadership of the meeting.
So the plan in that one precinct in Pierce County, it apparently worked. But what exactly does that mean? Here's what you need to know. Alex Hayes, who said in that video that he's supporting Romney, well, he may have actually duped those caucus goers by pretending they had a common enemy in Congressman Ron Paul. Apparently, the Santorum National Campaign, they were pretty upset when they heard about this unity slate. You see, the strategy appeared to be that they were going to block Ron Paul from getting delegates. Well, why would you do that? As I've told you, despite what most of the media is saying, Paul was winning huge numbers of delegates in Washington, Iowa, Maine and Alaska, in Colorado, Minnesota, Nevada, and Missouri. But Rick Santorum is not, and yet he has said that his strategy nationally is to prevent Governor Romney and any other candidate from getting to that magic number of 1,144 delegates needed before the convention in August in order to secure the nomination. So the unity slate, it doesn't help Santorum at all. It actually weakens his position by sharing delegates with Romney, which is why, from what I've been told, the National Santorum campaign has put the word out, no more unity slates. And that is reality.
So now that we are down to 2 GOP candidates, why is there so much infighting still taking place in those GOP caucuses? Doesn't Romney pretty much have the nomination now? Ben has the reality check you won't see anywhere else.
And then there were 2. Former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney and Texas Congressman Ron Paul are the only 2 candidates still vying for the Republican nomination. Tonight I'm going to show you 2 things. More of the fighting over delegates in Washington state and explain why that fighting is intensifying. Let's start in King County, Washington. The state of Washington has been holding its delegate caucuses as they're sending delegates on to the state convention, which will be held May 31st through June 2nd. Now, in order to choose those delegates, Washington is holding these delegate caucuses. And here's what happened in the King County 37th District Caucus over the weekend. The GOP representative is Lori Sotelo. Sotelo conducts the business of the caucus by holding a floor vote for a caucus chairman, and it happens correctly according to the rules. The problems start when a woman named Tamara Smilanich is voted in as caucus chairman. Sotelo begins to argue that because Tamara is a known Ron Paul supporter, the caucus cannot continue. Listen.
Ron Paul campaign does not have authority to rent this room. They have not provided insurance for this building. And Ron Paul campaign is Cameron Smilanich is a member of the Ron Paul campaign. And you do not.
She's not paid by the Ron Paul campaign.
You're the backup platform committee woman. And you do not have authority to run the meeting in this building. You will have 10 minutes before this building must be vacated.
To be clear on what is being said here, Sotelo claims that Smilanich is a Ron Paul operative. And therefore, in order for the caucus to continue, the Ron Paul campaign would have to pay for the insurance on the building and pay to rent the venue, which of course doesn't make sense at all. Nevertheless.
What I tried to explain to Tamara, what I explained to the Ron Paul campaign and their national campaign, and what I explained to Tamara in private, is that when a campaign, a political campaign, takes over a caucus, they are now the national campaign responsible for providing insurance, providing balloting, providing the liability for anything that goes on in this building.
The majority of people in the room begin to argue with Sotelo, asking what being elected caucus chair has to do with insurance liability. And then they even ask where the rule can be found in the list of Washington state GOP rules.
Can I request that the chair of the county party show us in the rules where it says that if a operative or not operative of any particular campaign gets elected to the chair position, then that campaign is then required to pay for the insurance and pay the rent. Where's that in the rules?
And once again, the rules are not being followed. So the caucus is actually moved outside, where Emily Rinsink, who took much of that video, tells me that 11 delegates were voted on.
There were 11 total, and we got all 11 delegates for Ron Paul. I feel like there's this impression of Ron Paul supporters that we're here just to be disruptive and to infiltrate the party, and I can only speak for myself, but that's not what it's about. We want to get involved. I'm genuinely a conservative, and I just want to get involved in the Republican Party.
So why is there such a fight in the Republican Party? Isn't it really all over? Didn't Romney already pretty much lock up the nomination? Well, actually, no. And this is what I've been telling you for months now. At its state convention, Washington will select 43 delegates to the RNC. Now, according to the delegate count on RealClearPolitics.com, in the state of Washington, Mitt Romney has 25 of those delegates already in his corner. Ron Paul has 8. But that's not true, because in the state of Washington, none of those delegates have been selected. Another example, the state of Iowa, which will send 28 delegates to the RNC. Iowa, Real Clear Politics says Romney has 6, Santorum 7, and Paul has 1. But it's not true. Actually, in Iowa, half of the delegates were just selected over the weekend. 13 people who will choose 13 delegates. And now we know 13 slots, Ron Paul delegates. The other 10, we don't know yet. One more for you. The state of Minnesota, which will send 40 delegates on to Tampa. In Minnesota, half of the delegates are called congressional district delegates. The other half at-large delegates. Well, The state of Minnesota voted over the weekend for the congressional district delegates, and here's what we know. 20 of the 24 went to Ron Paul. The other 13 will be voted on May 18th and 19th. And that's what you need to know. A month ago, not one media source other than Reality Check was correctly counting delegates. Therefore, you had no idea that Ron Paul or any other candidate could still win Minnesota or Iowa. Many people thought it was a done deal. And yet, it just happened. And that's why the fight in the Republican ranks is not over. Every state with unbound delegates is now a battleground for those delegates. And that is Reality Check.
If you would like to make your voice heard on the story, head over to Ben's Facebook page. You can find it by searching Ben Swann, WXIX.
Welcome back. Earlier in this special, we talked about the RNC and the Mitt Romney campaign setting up a shadow party in Nevada. And the reason for that tactic is pretty simple, because what the national media is not telling you is that there is a bigger fight here for more than just one Republican primary. So just to make the point clear, the Iowa GOP State Central Committee now has 6 members who have publicly expressed support for Ron Paul's candidacy. And that includes the new state chair of the Iowa Republican Party, A.J. Spiker, the former vice chairman for the Paul campaign in Iowa. Ron Paul supporters have also taken over the GOP in Louisiana, with not a bare majority, but a whopping 74% of the delegates to Louisiana's state convention in June. It's the same story in Alaska, where the Paul movement took over the Republican Party state convention. They elected 2 Ron Paul supporters to positions of state chair and co-chair. In Nevada, Paul supporters also elected to lead the state Republican Party. And in Maine, the same story, where 2 Paul supporters elected to the Republican National Committee, as well as a number of positions within the GOP leadership. Which is why in an article titled, "Forget the Nomination, Ron Paul's Revolution is Taking Over the Republican Party," W.E. Messmore writes this. He writes, quote, "Whether media commentators consider this change a good or bad thing for the Republican Party and for the future of American politics, they have an obligation to report it to their audiences and to acknowledge just how significant this change is. We are witnessing no less than a political revolution in the country and a major shift in the GOP's internal composition. For 2 election cycles now, Paul supporters were an outside minority that had to make their case to the party establishment. It looks like in 2014 and 2016, Republican candidates will have to make their case to Ron Paul supporters in many places." And that is exactly why Reality Check is covering this primary the way that we are. Too often people believe that our goal here is to promote the campaign of one person, Congressman Paul, or to work to derail the campaign of Governor Romney, and both ideas are simply incorrect. The goal here is to make sure that we are honestly covering what is, in reality, the biggest story of this presidential primary season. In the late 1980s, evangelical Christians began to make their voices heard in politics. It took the media a while to catch up, not realizing that this fringe group was about to take over the Republican Party. It did. Today, candidates can forget about winning the nomination of the party without that evangelical vote. And the same thing is happening again. The media, once again, they don't see it. There is a new fight for the Republican Party, one that will likely turn the grand old party, well, into a whole new party. Thanks for joining us tonight. Those here in Cincinnati, as well as viewers watching our live stream here in the U.S. and around the world. And don't forget, we're always on at fox19.com. Good night.
Even though there is little question that Mitt Romney will be the Republican nominee in August, state Republican conventions continue to come unraveled. This latest example, the Louisiana convention, where the chairman was tackled by cops. His artificial hip was dislocated. What's going on? Ben has the Reality Check you won't see anywhere else.
The video is pretty stunning, and it speaks for itself. Here's the background. At the state Republican convention in Louisiana last weekend, the Republican Party chairman, Roger Villeray, was acting as the convention chairman. He had already upset most of the people in attendance when the night before that convention, he sent out a whole new set of rules by which the convention would operate. When Republicans arrived at the state convention, 2/3 of the people in attendance, they passed a motion to remove the chairman, Roger Villeray. Now, if you're not sure what you just saw, the entire room picks up their chairs and turns their backs on the state Republican chairman. They then vote with a 2/3 majority to nominate and approve a convention chairman by the name of Henry Herford. Herford begins to conduct the business of the convention. He's only up there for about 3 minutes when he is rushed by a group of Shreveport police officers.
Hey, back up.
To be clear, the cops in this video, they are Shreveport, Louisiana police, but they're working off-duty as security. The police say they didn't hear Herford yelling that he's handicapped and that he has an artificial hip. Herford had to be carried out of the building, taken to the emergency room to have that artificial hip checked. He says it appears the hip came out of socket and then slid back in. The hospital visit, he says, cost $5,000. With Herford now gone, the crowd nominates his vice chair to take over. The crowd then nominates a slate of delegates, and the majority do not support Mitt Romney as the Republican nominee. But I talked with Henry Herford by telephone today, and he says the Republican leadership in Louisiana made a huge mistake.
Does it matter if we took all Ron Paul delegates from Louisiana? What does it matter to the National Convention? Supposedly they've got the votes to put Romney in. So what?
And that could be a major problem for Republicans in Louisiana if voters choose not to back the Republican candidate in November. Herford told me one more story about the huge reaction he has been seeing from across his home state.
I ran into the Democratic mayor of Delhi, Louisiana, and he's a man of I think he's about 62 years old. And he said, "My God, what have the Republicans done?" And I said, "It's a good question." He said, "I saw your video and I can't believe it."
And that is what you need to know. Anyone who thinks that what's happening in these conventions is all about Ron Paul and the Republican nomination, you've got it all wrong. What we've been telling you for months is that the real fight at these state conventions isn't over one candidate or one presidential nomination. It's about establishment Republicans who realize that there is a political force rising within their own party. In Louisiana, Herford says the state central committee, of which he is a member, is split right down the middle, establishment versus liberty. What the establishment folks in so many states are discovering in 2012 is that the harder they squeeze to hold on to power, the more their control of the party may be slipping through their fingers. And that is Reality Check.
If you'd like to make your voice heard in the story, head over to Ben's Facebook page. You can find
Of all the storylines of this year's Republican National Convention, one that is highly underreported but very important. How the Republican Party continues to change its own rules to control the outcome of the National Convention. The latest case of that, 17 delegates from the state of Massachusetts who have now been stripped of their credentials. And just wait till you hear why. It's a reality check you won't see anywhere else. For months, we've been telling you about this ongoing fight between the Republican establishment and the Liberty wing of the Republican Party. We've also told you how these two wings of the party are battling over delegate slots while heading to Tampa. Several weeks ago, we told you how that Liberty wing in Massachusetts pulled a coup, won 17 delegate slots to go to the National Convention. In the delegate process, you can't just take a slot. You have to be elected by Republicans, and that requires a lot of legwork. Carol Claros is one of those Massachusetts delegates.
We worked really hard, like the good old-fashioned way. We, got a list of Republican donors. We phone banked every weekend. Even at home, I was calling people while I was cooking dinner.
And the work paid off for Claros, who was one of 17 pro-liberty delegates who were elected to go to Tampa and cast a vote for the Republican nominee for president.
We beat some pretty big name people, Carrie Healy, Charlie Baker, a sheriff from my town we beat a few state representatives, some state committee people, district attorneys. And we're just regular folk.
But before the dust had settled, the Republican leadership issued a decree that all delegates must sign a legal affidavit that they will vote for Mitt Romney in the first round of the National Convention. Claros says that the affidavit was messy, poorly written, and that's not all.
Not only that, but when it was mailed to me, it was mailed to the incorrect address. It was not even, certified mail. Nobody had to sign for it. It was just sent snail mail. And I had less than 3 days to get this thing, signed, notarized, sent out to them by the deadline.
Now keep in mind, this has never been asked for before in the state of Massachusetts. The Republican Party has never required that delegates sign an affidavit. Not only that, but all 17 of these Liberty delegates verbally committed to voting for Mitt Romney in the first round of voting at the RNC. Those verbal commitments, they were made in front of caucus goers, and they were affirmed not once, but 3 times. Even so, virtually all 17 delegates finally decided to go ahead and sign that affidavit to make sure they were seated. Again, this has never been asked of a delegate before. Even though they did so, apparently it wasn't enough. The Massachusetts State GOP officially decided to strip all 17 of those pro-liberty delegates of their credentials and have them replaced.
They look for, young voters, and they turn away an 18-year-old. They're looking for Hispanic voters. I'm Hispanic. I'm first generation born in this country representing my Colombian-born family, and they kicked me out. I'm a mother. They kicked me out. They're kicking out business owners, nurses. It's ridiculous.
Which has left these Massachusetts delegates heading to Tampa anyways to fight to be reinstated.
We had every plan and every intention to go down and represent the state of Massachusetts and vote for Mitt Romney, and we really wanted to have a say in the platform about auditing the Federal Reserve and, having Congress only declare wars. The president just can't, go and declare wars. And we really wanted to speak out about keeping the internet free from the government.
And that may be what you need to know. Look, some of the delegates who were supposed to replace these 17 say they won't do it because the action was illegal. But at this point, it seems that what the Republican leadership is doing isn't even about the presidential nomination anymore. It actually seems to be much more about silencing the Liberty delegates who, regardless of the nominee, will have a say in shaping the party's platform for the next 2 to 4 years. The push by Republican leadership now seems to be to keep these Liberty delegates out of Tampa and away from the convention as much as possible. It's the only thing that makes sense when a state like Massachusetts, that's only 11% Republican and dropping, would work so actively to disenfranchise these delegates, and not only them, but the more than 2,000 Republicans who voted for delegates in the process. And that is Reality Check.
A month before the Republican National Convention, and the Republican National Committee continues to stir up controversy by attempting to strip Republican delegates of their credentials. Why would the RNC do that? How could it possibly benefit the party? Ben has the reality check you won't see anywhere else.
Well, major developments in the lead up to the Republican National Convention, and the latest began just over a week ago. In the state of Maine, as we've told you, 21 of the 24 at-large delegates elected to represent the state's Republican Party do not support Governor Mitt Romney. They are Liberty delegates who support Congressman Ron Paul. Well, just over a week ago, 20 of those 21 Liberty delegates, plus another 20 alternates, everyone except for the governor of Maine, Paul LePage, received notice that the RNC has been asked to not seat their entire delegation. Now, the official notice came in a manila envelope, each one mailed to each one of those delegates. But according to the postmark on the envelope, the notice didn't come from someone in Maine. Rather, it came from a 02109 zip code. It's one in Boston, the same zip code where the official Romney for President headquarters are located. Matt McDonald is one of those Maine delegates.
There's a gentleman by the name of Peter Chinchette and a lady named Jan Staples, who is the National Committee woman from the state of Maine to the Republican Party. They're saying that the rules at the convention of the Republicans of Maine back in May were broken. The credentials were not there. There was illegal votes. And so they're petitioning the RNC that we not be seated.
Oh, but it gets better. This past weekend, those Liberty delegates received an offer of compromise from the RNC with 5 criteria. 1, a majority of the delegates sign a statement agreeing that if Ron Paul is not on the ballot, they will vote at the convention for Mitt Romney. 2, instead of Brent Tweed, Charlie Webster, or Paul LePage would serve as the spokesperson for the delegation and announce the votes cast for president. That spokesperson, by the way, would also handle all media on behalf of the Maine delegation. 3, there is nothing negative said about Mitt Romney or positive said about President Obama, especially to the media. 4, the delegation will be admitted to the convention and to all committee assignments without barrier. And 5, the contest brought by Jan Staples and Peter Chinchette will be withdrawn. Well, today the Maine delegation responded saying no deal to that so-called compromise. But there is another question here. Why would the Romney campaign, who seems to be having a very tough time finding their footing against President Obama, waste energy and resources fighting with a small number of Republican delegates? Well, that's what you need to know. The 5-state rule. Under the RNC rules, in order for a candidate's name to go into nomination at the convention, they must have the support of a plurality of delegates from 5 states. Now, not win 5 states in the primary, but have support from a plurality of delegates. Congressman Paul has the plurality in Minnesota, Iowa, Nevada, Virginia, Maine, Oregon, and Louisiana, 7 states. Already the GOP in Louisiana are replacing delegates who are Paul supporters with Romney supporters. The same thing happened in Oregon, trying to knock those 7 states down to just 5. Remove the delegates from one of the 5 remaining states, like Maine, and the only name that can go into nomination at the Republican National Convention is Governor Romney. At this point, it's not about winning the nomination. It seems to be about the appearance of things, the appearance of unity, the appearance that Romney has the full support of conservatives, and yet he does not. That explains why, in the Maine compromise, delegates are asked not to speak to the media, to say nothing negative about Governor Romney and nothing positive about President Obama. It appears as though in order to create the appearance of a unified party, the RNC wants to not just bind delegates' votes, they're also attempting to bind their freedom of speech as well. And that is Reality Check.
2 weeks from the Republican National Convention, and the RNC Rules Committee has ruled on the case of the Oklahoma Republican delegates who say the state GOP broke their own rules. So what did the Rules Committee decide? In our commitment to Balanced News, Ben has the reality check you won't see anywhere else.
The case the RNC Rules Committee heard was very simple. Back on May 12th, when the Republican Party of Oklahoma held its state convention, there were all kinds of problems. But the biggest problem came at the end of the night. That's when state delegates were supposed to elect national delegates to go to the Republican National Convention. But the Republican leadership didn't like the way the votes were going, and so they did not call for a roll call vote, which is stated in the rules of the Oklahoma Republican Party. Instead, they called for a voice vote and had people stand. Because they attempted to end the convention early, a separate convention was held outside in the parking lot. Well, as of today, 13 delegates have contested the outcome of that state convention, and they submitted a simple 3-page complaint to the RNC Rules Committee. Their argument, again, was pretty simple, that the party rules were not followed, and therefore the 25 delegates and 25 alternates should not be seated at the Republican National Convention in Tampa. This week, the RNC Rules Committee came to a decision on that complaint. Kadosha Fish is one of those contesting the outcome.
This issue is so easy for anyone can understand it. You know, it's not hard to understand. The election of delegates at large and alternates at large shall be by roll call vote. I mean, that's as plain of English as you can get. So what happened? In a 4-page response, the Rules Committee decided, number 1, that state party rules require that a roll call vote be taken. 2, that state party rules do not allow a voice vote and standing vote only. Number 3, that state party rules trump the convention rules. But then they ruled that the voice vote and the standing vote were good enough to elect delegates. And 2, that there's no reason to believe that if a roll call vote had been taken, the end result would be any different. You see, Fish and the other delegates say this isn't even about overturning the end result. It's about a fair process. Why have rules if you're not going to follow them? You know, because if you have rules and you don't follow them, you make yourself look like a total idiot. And, you know, why would someone want to be involved in a party that doesn't want to follow their own rules? So what you need to know is that in the Oklahoma case, the RNC Rules Committee decided that while the state party did not follow its own rules, the RNC wasn't going to require them to follow them. On the other hand, the Rules Committee also just ruled on the delegates from Maine. We've told you that the entire delegation is being challenged by the Romney campaign. But the end result there, the RNC Rules Committee just decided that the Romney campaign has no grounds to contest those delegates, and yet the RNC Rules Committee changed their own rules so they wouldn't have to officially rule on the issue, instead leaving it open for a second challenge
from the Romney folks. So the issue here, is it any wonder that the RNC Rules Committee wouldn't enforce rules on the states like Oklahoma? The RNC Rules Committee won't even follow its own rules. And that is Reality Check.
So what do you think?
Thanks so much. The Republican National Convention kicks off in 4 days in Tampa. And just in time for the convention, an entire state's delegates are replaced by the RNC. It's a story that we've been following for 6 months. Tonight, Ben has the reality check that you won't see anywhere else.
Only a few days before the Republican Party holds its convention in Tampa. We've been following the delegate process for months, almost to the point of exhaustion, and yet no one else will do it. For months, we've also told you how the RNC just won't follow its own rules. Well, now that we're days away, the final attempts to control every aspect of that convention have fallen into place. The biggest fear for the RNC is that the appearance at the convention will be that 100% of the delegates don't want Mitt Romney. The only problem is they don't. Whether you like them or not, almost 20% of the delegates who will be in Tampa next week don't support Romney. Nearly 20% support Congressman Ron Paul, others support Rick Santorum, and still others Newt Gingrich. But the delegates who support Santorum or Gingrich have no ability to cause problems because of the RNC's 5-state rule. You see, under that rule, a delegate must have a plurality of delegates from 5 states in order to have their name nominated from the convention floor. As I've told you, unlike Gingrich and Santorum, Congressman Paul has that plurality. The majority of delegates in Maine, Minnesota, Nevada, Iowa, and Virginia are Paul supporters. He also had a majority in Oregon and Louisiana, plus a large group of 17 delegates from Massachusetts. Now, as I've told you, the RNC for months has been stripping those delegates of their credentials. The Massachusetts 17, as they're called, removed. The entire Louisiana Liberty delegation removed. Oklahoma not seated because the RNC Rules Committee allowed the state to break its own rules. The same thing happened in Oregon. But even after continuously breaking their own rules and stripping so many states of these delegates, the RNC came up short. The 5-state rule was still a problem because a plurality of 5 states was still intact. Again, Maine, Minnesota, Iowa, Nevada, and Virginia. So what to do? Well, just change the rules. You see, this week, the RNC Rules Committee tried to take care of their 5-state problem by changing the 5-state rule. A motion was made in the Rules Committee to increase the number of states from 5 to 10. But the motion failed by 1 vote. What was changed, delegates must indicate in writing at least 1 hour before the vote who they intend to nominate. By the way, it was a Republican committeeman from Virginia who fought against that change, saying it was unfair to change the rule just to prevent Ron Paul's name from being placed into nomination after he'd already won 5 states. So that didn't work. Instead, the RNC decided to take another extraordinary step. In this case, the RNC decided to go back and reinstate some of those Liberty delegates, actually give them back their seats from states where they had stripped them of their credentials. The Massachusetts 17, this week, 11 of them were reinstated. In Louisiana, 27 of the 46 had been Liberty delegates. Well, the RNC this week reinstated 17 of them. That's good news, right? But if the RNC is going to give a little, it's also going to take a little, like the delegation from Maine. As of today, all but 5 of Maine's 48 delegates and alternates may not be seated. The RNC Committee on Contests is recommending to the full RNC complete invalidation of the Maine convention and the decertification of the Maine delegation. The RNC is only planning to seat the state party chairman, the national committeeman, the national committeewoman, Governor Paul LePage, and his wife, Mrs. LePage. Rather than allowing Republicans in Maine, though, to choose the replacements, the Rules Committee is also recommending that the RNC break one more rule and simply appoint a new Maine delegation. So what you need to know? The delegates from Maine who were elected to those spots by voters in Maine are heading to Tampa no matter what the RNC says, and they say they're going to fight for those spots. But the bigger issue here, again, why have rules if you don't follow them? Why does the RNC even have a 5-state rule if a candidate gets 5 states and then they want to change it to a 10-state rule? And then when that doesn't work, they just remove delegates, an entire state's worth of delegates, and replace them with people who will do what they say. Because at the end of the day, that's all that either party really seems to be interested in. And that is Reality Check.
The Republican National Convention is underway in Tampa. Tomorrow, nominations will be placed for the Republican nominee, Mitt Romney. But it isn't without some controversy. And today, that controversy began to spread to big-name Tea Party leaders. Saturday, Ben sat down exclusively with Governor Mitt Romney and Congressman Paul Ryan. And he asked them about the delegate process for the Republicans coming a little bit unraveled. This is a reality check you won't see anywhere else.
To say the Republican National Convention is a mess would be a huge understatement. We told you last week that the entire state of Maine was stripped of their credentials because they were going to vote for Congressman Ron Paul and not for Governor Mitt Romney. As a result, Maine's governor, Paul LePage, is boycotting the RNC. Saturday, I was given an exclusive opportunity to talk with Governor Romney and Congressman Paul Ryan one-on-one. The interview, though, had conditions. It was supposed to be about what the two will do for the state of Ohio. We covered those issues as I said that we would in order to be granted that interview. But as we were getting the signal to wrap it up, I wasn't going to let this opportunity to go by without first asking how the governor could support the RNC stripping these Maine delegates of their credentials. I asked it even though we were told that the campaign did not want to talk about delegates.
Yesterday, the RNC chose to remove the entire Maine delegation from being able to be seated as a part of that. Do you believe that that is the right step for the RNC to have taken, considering the fact that these people were elected, they're Republicans who were elected by Republicans to go and represent the state of Maine?
You know, I haven't seen the inner politics of what's gone on, and I'm not going to comment on the RNC's decision. I really haven't looked at this.
Really? So Governor Romney claims he wasn't aware of his own campaign having an entire state of delegates stripped of their credentials? Hard to believe when it was his campaign that led the challenge of these delegates. But then again, Governor Romney also claims to not have realized that his chief legal counsel just pushed through what many top GOP leaders are calling the biggest GOP power grab in the party's history. So here's what happened. Conservatives and even some moderates are accusing the Romney chief attorney, Ben Ginsburg, of pushing through a rules change for delegate selection that would give Mitt Romney enormous power over the primary process, should he win the White House and seek re-election in 2016. According to the Washington Times, Ginsburg persuaded the RNC Rules Committee members to let Mr. Romney, if he becomes president, decide which delegates will be seated at the 2016 GOP presidential nominating convention. It also calls for letting future presidential hopefuls decide who gets to take the delegate slots that they win in each state. Tea Party supporter and the founder of Freedom Works, Dick Armey, came out strongly against this RNC rule, saying this, quote, "The process has always been bottom-up, but Romney officials have rewritten the rules so that the nominee can stifle any dissent on the platform committee and even unseat delegates. Make no mistake, this will weaken the process by which Republicans choose their candidate for president and push the grassroots out of the party process." So when Romney told me on Saturday that he isn't worried about the delegates, he apparently meant it.
I'm sure that the convention will work just fine. We'll have a lot of delegates there. We're going to get the nomination. I'm not worried about that.
So what you need to know is that there is a saying in Maine: as Maine goes, so goes the rest of the nation. And that's why this delegate battle in Maine really is so important. Let me break this down like this. In Maine, Republican delegates were elected by Republicans. The RNC didn't like who they were going to vote for, even though under state rules they had every right. So the RNC said, we're going to replace those delegates with ones who will vote the way we want. Under this new rule change, in 2016, the same thing that happened this year in Maine will happen to every state in the country. One campaign will have veto power over every single delegate, which means party bosses run everything, and those at the grassroots level are cut off. And that is Reality Check. Well, if you'd like to make your voice heard on the story, you can... There is so much to tell you tonight, it will be difficult to get it all in. But let's start with the rule change. The RNC pushed through a new rule that will forever change the way that Republicans choose their candidates. Rule 16 is for the election, selection, allocation, or binding of delegates and alternate delegates. Any statewide presidential preference vote for the Republican nomination for president in a primary, caucus, or a state convention must be used to allocate and bind the state's delegation to the national convention in either a proportional or winner-take-all manner. In layman's terms, that means there are no more free delegates to vote as they choose. And then part 2, no delegate or alternate delegate who is bound or allocated to a particular presidential candidate may be certified if the presidential candidate to whom the delegate or alternate delegate is bound or allocated has, in consultation with the state party, disavowed the delegate or alternate delegate. Again, what does that mean? It means no delegate, even if elected by Republicans of that state, may serve as a delegate if the candidate and the state party decide they don't like them and they want to replace them. Conservatives, Tea Party members, and Liberty supporters immediately vowed a floor fight over this rule. On Tuesday morning, delegates from Virginia and Rhode Island were on their way to lead that fight when their bus driver refused to stop at the convention center 3 times, circling the building, then leaving the area altogether. And when they returned to the convention center, well, the delegates had already missed their chance to vote on this issue. One of those Virginia delegates, Matthew Hurt, tweeted as this was going on. Take a look. Morton Blackwell is on a bus outside the Rules Committee where he's needed to fight for grassroots conservatives. We have looped around the GOP convention twice and driven away from it. Rules Committee member Morton Blackwell still on the bus. So who is this Morton Blackwell that was trapped on this bus with Virginia delegates? Blackwell is a member of the RNC Rules Committee, and he was the most ardent advocate opposed to the rules change. Now, inside the convention hall, delegates who did make it, they were asked by Speaker of the House John Boehner to vote on adopting this new rule. Now listen as the vote is taken.
The question is on the adoption of the resolution. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no. Pending another chair, the ayes have it. The resolution is adopted. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it? How could the Speaker of the House determine clearly how many voted aye and how many voted no? Listen again, but this time to cell phone video from inside the crowd. Well, maybe there's a good reason, a really good reason, that Boehner claimed the ayes had it. Today, incredible cell phone video was released as delegates stood by and videotaped the teleprompter that Speaker Boehner was reading from. We're going to take this video full so you can read along for yourself.
Thank you for putting this question is ordered. The question is on the adoption of the resolution. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it.
So, the most controversial rule in the Republican Party history, according to countless conservatives, wasn't voted through at all. It was scripted. Despite the shouts of what at least half the room of delegates appeared to have been voting, Boehner just read along with the script. So why is this rule so controversial? Well, consider this. In 1976, Ronald Reagan was a conservative outsider in the Republican Party. But delegates who were conservatives fought back against a presumptive nominee at the time, Gerald Ford, and they forced a brokered convention. Reagan nearly upset Ford thanks to conservative delegates who had had enough with progressive republicanism. Brian Doherty is a Republican National Convention delegate from Pennsylvania. He made this point about this rule change this week. Quote, "Now these rules as they are, if they were in place in 1976, Ronald Reagan would never have risen to power in the Republican Party. When he challenged Ford in '76, he would not have had a say. And then he would not have been in a position to win in 1980. So we would not have a President Reagan if those rules had existed back then." So what you need to know is that the Republican Party didn't need to do any of this to nominate Mitt Romney. Romney had the nomination. He had the numbers at least. But looking ahead, it appears the party was so concerned about not having to put up with Tea Party candidates or Liberty candidates in the future, or apparently with those conservatives like Ronald Reagan in the past, that they were willing to start a civil war for control of the party. Make no mistake, what happened in Tampa will not stay in Tampa. And that is Reality Check.
We turn now to a major eruption of fury at the Republican National Convention on Tuesday as the formal nomination process got underway. Part of Maine's delegation stormed off the floor in protest against a decision to strip away half of the state's Ron Paul delegates. Supportive members of other delegations rose to their feet and hollered their objections, angered by new rules that they say will make it harder for grassroots candidates to stand a chance in future elections. His ardent followers used seldom evoked state party rules to garner 20 of Maine's 24 spots.
The RNC responded by replacing 10 of them, enough to prevent Ron Paul from being nominated from the floor.
The question on the motion offered by the delegate from Kentucky. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no.
The decision caused an immediate uproar, but RNC Chair Reince Priebus was in no mood to take a roll call.
Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. We have to proceed with the order of business.
We sat here and objected. He said, are there any objections? We objected. And you know, it's like, why even ask the question at that point?
Maine got screwed of half their delegates, more than half actually. That's why their governor's not here today, because he said he wouldn't come down unless their delegates got seated. Half of them got taken away, and they were replaced by people that the Republican Party, the RNC picked.
Several members of the Maine delegation walked off the floor in protest after the convention decided to replace 10 of its 24 delegates.
Convention is a farce! They stop in there talking about we support our soldiers. They got rid of 7 of them on our delegations. 2 recently serving in Afghanistan and Iraq. How dare they? Shame on them! Shame on them!
The people of Maine should be respected. Those voters that put us here, they should be respected. This is a sham. I love every one of you guys, and I love all those people back home.
Others on the floor were equally outraged. Kevin Erickson is a delegate from Minnesota.
What this means is that the states will no longer retain the right under the new rules to elect their delegates and have them stand. A presumptive nominee will be able to unseat an entire state's delegates if they don't like who's on the slate. Giving a presidential candidate veto power over a state's delegation means that future conventions will not have a dissenting voice. We won't be able to bring motions and amendments to our platform. We won't be able to speak for people who believe differently. You're taking a broad tent and a grassroots party, and you're turning it into a dictatorship that'll be run by a few people with a lot of money. And average, ordinary people like myself will be out of luck and out of a voice.
The question is on the adoption of the resolution. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no. Any other chair? The ayes have it. The resolution's adopted. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it.
The question is on the motion that the Honorable Paul Ryan be nominated by acclamation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
And I have to explain the cheers that we've been hearing. I had to turn around to see what was going on. It was Congressman Ron Paul entering the forum. He still has very much a role within this Republican Party.
Yeah, he is. I just saw him come through here, and as he went by me, there were a lot of young voters. They're the ones who really loved him, stopping him, taking pictures of him to tweet out. And he came in with his same smile that he's had, and he's become something of a cult hero in the party.
Let him speak! 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 Let him speak!
Iowa cast 22 votes for Ron Paul.
and 6 votes for Mitt Romney.
Iowa, 6, Romney.
Minnesota, where we are very proud of our state Republican Party, which runs a fair convention with integrity. It casts 33 votes for Ron Paul. 1 vote for Senator Rick Santorum, and 6 votes for Governor Romney.
Minnesota, 6, Romney.
We proudly cast 17 votes for Congressman Ron Paul, 5 abstentions, and 5 for Romney.
Nevada, 5, Romney.
Nevada, 5, Romney.
I got to tell you, and I like your dad, you love your dad, but I like him a lot. I was pretty shocked to hear that they wouldn't even read from the podium how many votes Congressman Paul got.
Well, one of the interesting things was the crowd was reciting how many he got, so when they wouldn't announce it from the podium, you would hear an echo from the crowd of the Ron Paul supporters who were announcing his
Why
totals.
didn't they do that? This seems so petty and so ridiculous. I mean, your father worked hard in the Republican Party. He went through all the rules. I believe he didn't do anything illegal in getting those votes. He went through the process. This is the last time he's running for president of the United States. I just thought it was inappropriate to end his political career, if you will, on a note like this before his own party.